All right, let's jump right in. The central idea we're going to unpack today is this: the city is never just a neutral backdrop for our lives. It's not a mere container. Instead, we need to read it as a physical text, one that's deeply inscribed with the dominant ideologies and power structures of its time. We're going to learn how to read that text. So, here's our intellectual roadmap. We'll start by really grounding that core thesis. Then we'll examine how it plays out in a few key arenas: the public square, the massive experiment of modernism, and the ongoing cycles of urban renewal. And finally, we'll pull it all together and ask what this means for the cities we're building today.
Okay, so first things first, how does political power actually get written into the physical environment? We'll dig into this by looking at how very different political and economic systems end up producing radically different kinds of cities.
This slide presents a fantastic juxtaposition, a real dialectic. On the one hand, you have Tiananmen Square. Its sheer, immense scale isn't an accident. It's designed for state spectacle, for massive demonstrations of centralized power, not for casual human interaction. And then, right next to it, Barcelona's Gothic quarter, a dense, winding, pedestrian-scaled fabric that grew organically out of medieval commerce. You're seeing two totally different logics made manifest, one of state power, the other of a human-scaled mercantile society.
And this isn't just a one-off phenomenon. We can see these mechanisms of ideological expression all over. In medieval Bern, the city's very shape follows the practical logic of a market hugging a river. Then you look at Bath, and you see something else entirely, a disciplined, almost theatrical real estate venture, creating this rigid Baroque framework of crescents and squares for an aristocratic society. Or colonial Buenos Aires, where the laws of the Indies imposed a simple grid, a powerful tool for control, for military movement, and for colonization.
All right, now let's zoom in on a very specific and, I think, a critical urban space: the public square. This is where the intended, top-down story of a space so often collides with the messy, bottom-up reality of how people actually live in it. This quote, this really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? It frames the public square as more than just an open space. It's a barometer. It measures political and social freedom. The power isn't just legible in the physical form itself, but in how that form can be used, or, more importantly, how that use is controlled.
And this table gives us some really concrete examples of that contestation. Take the Plaza de Mayo, designed as a colonial administrative hub. It was completely reappropriated by the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo as a site of protest. Tiananmen, a stage for state power, became the site of the 1989 pro-democracy movement. Even Barcelona's Plaza Real, meant to be a serene royal square, took on a life of its own that defied its formal design. In every single case, the public finds a way to subvert the state's intended script.
Let's pivot now. We're going to shift into the 20th century to talk about the radical break that was modernism. And we have to understand, this wasn't just a new style. It was a deeply socio-political project that believed it could remake society itself by completely remaking the city. Neri's words on Chandigarh are so telling. They perfectly capture the spirit of this post-colonial modernist project. This was an ideological statement. It was about creating a new kind of nation, a nation free from the baggage of the past, by literally building a new kind of urban form from scratch. So where did these ideas come from? Well, a lot of the theoretical framework was codified by CIM, the International Congresses of Modern Architecture. Their concept of the functionalist city was basically a manifesto. It called for strict, segregated zones for living, working, and recreation. Buildings were to be like sculptures in a park, and the whole thing was stitched together by highways for the automobile. This was the blueprint for cities like Brasília and Chandigarh.
And we cannot forget the social agenda here. As the anthropologist James Holston points out, this wasn't just about making things efficient. There was this profound, and you could argue deeply naive belief that rational design, that the right kind of architecture, could literally engineer social equity. Brasília was meant to be an instrument for fixing social injustice.
So when you look at these two iconic projects, you see that ideology made real. Both were these grand symbolic frameworks for new national identities. And, both have faced remarkably similar criticisms over the years. The inhuman scale, the complete dependence on the car, the feeling of desolation in these vast ceremonial landscapes. These are the recurring themes when you talk about the lived experience of these modernist utopias. And all that criticism leads us directly to a crucial tension in all of urban planning: that massive gap between the planner's clean blueprint
and the messy, complex, unpredictable reality of how cities are actually lived in, adapted, and remade from the ground up. Barcelona's Eixample district is probably the textbook case for this. Ildefons Cerda's original vision was just beautiful, almost utopian. A green, low-density city where blocks were only built on two sides to create these huge interior gardens. But the logic of capital, of real estate development, it just proved to be a much stronger force. Within a decade, his rules were ignored, all four sides of the blocks got built up, the courtyards were filled in, and it created the dense, vibrant city we know today. Copley Square in Boston gives us a different kind of lesson. It shows us that urban design is often just a process of trial and error. That 1968 design, the sunken plaza, was a classic modernist move. The idea was to create a quiet refuge from the street. But in reality, it just created a barrier, alienating the square from the life of the city. It failed. And it took a campaign from the public to get it redesigned in 1984, bringing it back up to street level and correcting the mistake based on actual social feedback. This process of adaptation often falls into a pretty recognizable cycle. Step 1, an area, let's say like Dublin's Temple Bar, falls into neglect. Step 2, because the rents are cheap, artists and creatives move in and they create a genuinely authentic cultural hub. Step 3, the planners and developers notice. They intervene, and they often sanitize and commercialize the space. And finally, step 4. This process might save the old buildings, but rising rents push out the very community that made it interesting in the first place, which sparks all these critical debates about authenticity and the right to the city. So after going through all this, what are the takeaways? What are the lessons for contemporary urban policy, for design, for research? How do we synthesize all this into a framework for thinking about the future? I find this quote from the architects who renovated Bergen's public spaces to be a really powerful guide. They're pushing back against this constant tendency to over-design, to over-program every square inch of our cities. They're advocating for a kind of restraint. The idea that our job is to create simple, robust frameworks that enable public life, not dictate it. And that brings us to what I think are a few core principles for more critical urbanism. First, we have to design with humility, just accepting that there's always going to be a gap between our intent and the reality. We have to prioritize adaptability over rigid plans. We need to learn to embrace the messy but vital energy of organic urban life. And maybe most important of all, we have to constantly critique power. Always ask, who does this design serve? What future is it trying to build? And so this leaves us with one final, and I think pretty challenging question. If we accept this premise that every plaza, every street grid, every building is expressing an ideology, then we have to ask ourselves as we look at the cities rising around us, what future exactly are we building today? And for whom?